Hi everybody, this is the first video that I'm going to record. Bear with me, I'm probably going to make a lot of mistakes and it's going to be pretty bad. Um, but this is the video for the definition of death. Alright, so I hope you've already read the Singer article. It's one that I quizzed you on before we left for break. And so today I just want to be going over that article. Okay? Um, so let me give you an outline of what I want to cover. I want to give you a little bit of context. I want to talk about Singer's argument, which includes, oh, I'm sorry, I already made my first mistake. I want to tell you about the Harvard Ad Hoc Committee report, which Singer talks about. And then within Singer's argument, I want to talk about how he says whole brain death is what he calls a convenient fiction. So we'll talk about that. We'll talk about two objections that he considers, a diagnosis and two cases, and then three questions. Okay? Remember also these videos, you can, if you're able to, listen to them at 1.5 speed or 2 times speed, if you're able to do that. You can also pause and rewind if you didn't quite catch what I said. You can also email me and ask me if I mumble or if you couldn't quite hear or make out what I said. But anyway, you could also rewind. And so I'm going to not repeat myself as much as I normally would in class, because I assume that you can just pause and rewind whenever you need to go over something that's important and complicated. All right, so if this was an in-person class, the first thing I would ask you to do is think about the following kind of scenario. Suppose you are a medical student on a neurology ward, and you have a patient who just had a massive stroke, and they are taking up a hospital bed, maybe in the ICU. They're not really moving much. Maybe there's a ventilator to help them breathe. And the neurologist in charge wants you to go in and test whether this person is dead. So the neurologist says, I don't have time for this. You go in there, do whatever tests you need to do, and come out and tell me whether he's dead. So the question for you is, what tests would you want to perform to see whether this person is dead? So if this was an in-class exercise, I would pause, and I would ask you, and we would discuss the answers that you all come up with. We can't do that, obviously, in an online course, but you can still, if you want to, pause the recording right here. Think about what your answers would be, how you would figure out if someone is dead. Okay? Okay, now you can resume again if you've done that. Probably you haven't, but okay, maybe you did. There are 3 main criteria that are kind of rivals. I guess I'll call them not just criteria, but just kind of 3 rival criteria of death, okay, that are often used, that are often debated in the literature. So one is what I'm going to call cardiac respiratory function, okay. The other is, or the second one is what I'm going to call whole brain, or what is called in the literature whole brain death. And the final one is called higher brain death, okay. And these often are abbreviated. So CRF, sometimes for cardiac respiratory function. Whole brain death is sometimes WBD, and then higher brain death, HBD. Okay? Higher brain death is also sometimes called PVS for persistent vegetative state, which is basically, like a vegetable. Okay? Whole brain death, this is a little bit confusing, but sometimes journalists, people who are not really medical professionals, will sometimes just call whole brain death without saying right here that it's whole brain death or higher brain death. They'll just say brain death. This can be confusing, but if you ever read newspaper articles or something on this topic and they talk about brain death, really what they're referring to is what we call whole brain death. Okay? So what's the difference between these? I'm going to get to that in a second, but before I do, I guess I want to show you one of the 2 prepared slides that I have for today. If we were in class, I would not have prepared slides. I would have drawn a little picture of this, okay? So whole brain death refers to death of this whole organ, all of this stuff, okay? Higher brain death refers to the death of kind of this wrinkly outer part, which is just the cortex, okay? This part is called the cortex, whereas the colored part, I got this picture from Wikipedia, the Wikipedia entry, I think, for the brainstem, but higher brain death just refers to the death of the cortex. Whole brain death refers to the death of the whole thing, the difference being the addition in whole brain death of this part right here, the brainstem, okay? It's split into three parts, the brainstem, the midbrain, the pons asinorum, and the medulla. We don't need to know that. For our purposes, we just treat this part that I'm circling with my cursor here as one organ, which is the brainstem, and that's included in whole brain death, but not included in so-called higher brain death, which is, again, just the cortex, okay? So I'm going to go back to this slide and modify that, okay? So that we have this information. So whole brain death refers to cortex plus brainstem death, okay? And higher brain death refers to just cortical death, not necessarily, or maybe I shouldn't say not necessarily, does not include brainstem death. Okay. And again, I will go over some of the differences of this in a little bit. Okay, now, why has there been such a debate about these different criteria of death? Well, Singer actually has kind of a nice discussion of this in the beginning of his article, and he gets the history basically right. So the history of this debate is, the debate started basically in the latter half of the 20th century, as Singer says. So, we have a little slide here. The history of the debate, okay? And it was kind of pushed, the debate was kind of pushed because of two technological innovations. If we were in class, I would pause and ask you, do you remember what these two technological innovations were? Because Singer talks about them both, okay? But since we're not in class, I'll just tell you. One technological innovation was the invention of ventilating machines, ventilators, and basically intensive care units, okay? So ventilators are devices that are used to breathe for people when they can no longer breathe for themselves. They're basically like giant accordions. You know the accordion, the musical instrument that kind of pushes air in and out of itself and kind of whistles and wheezes, and that's how it produces music? Well, basically, a ventilator is like that, except it just pushes air directly into your lungs, okay? So these things were invented sometime in the middle of the 20th century. And what they allowed people to do is to keep people alive with the help of the ventilator who otherwise would have died. Okay, so that's one thing. The other invention was basically the invention of kind of organ transplants, okay? First kidneys, solid organs, and then several other kinds of organs like livers and hearts and lungs and so on, okay? Now, why are these two technological innovations the kind of things that pushed doctors to think about potentially redefining death? Well, it's because we had kind of this problem. We had a potential problem and a potential solution, okay? The invention of organ transplants created a potential problem, okay, which is there's a massive shortage of organs. Many more people need organs than there are donors, okay? That's the potential problem. The invention of organ transplants led to this problem that, hey, we can transplant these kidneys and livers and so on, but we don't have enough of them. Okay, and then here's this potential, it's kind of grisly to think about, but this is the brutal, honest truth. The potential solution was, on the one hand, these transplant surgeons were looking around saying, oh my God, I have so many patients who need organs, what are we going to do? And then they would look to the next room, the intensive care units right next door, and say, hey, look at all these people in the intensive care unit who have all these perfectly good livers and kidneys, but their brains are shot. They had a massive stroke. Their brain is never going to work again. They're never going to wake up. They're just sitting on ventilators, basically waiting to die. But their kidneys and livers and hearts and lungs are perfect. Okay, so the potential solution was people on ventilators with perfectly healthy kidneys, livers, hearts, lungs, okay, weren't dying. They weren't dying, but they were just kind of taking up space, okay? And so some doctors had the idea, they said, well, aren't these two things, can't we just use one of these things to solve the other? These people who are on ventilators with perfectly healthy kidneys, livers, hearts, lungs, etc., okay, their brains are totally shot, but we are classifying them as alive. Why are we doing that? Why don't we just call them dead? Maybe they are dead, in which case, once they're dead, we can just take their organs and then solve this other problem, the potential problem of a massive shortage of organs, okay? So that's kind of why we're having this debate. Okay. Which leads to kind of differences in the three definitions of death. Okay, so CRF, or cardiac respiratory function, is the first one. And CRF, if you remember, is cardiac respiratory function. Okay, and this was the traditional definition of death. And this basically says, when your heart and lungs stop permanently, you're dead, okay? And then in contrast were the two, remember there are two brain death definitions, and these basically roughly will say, when your brain is dead, you are dead, okay? And remember there were two brain death definitions. There's whole brain death, okay, and higher brain death, okay? And remember higher brain death, well, I think I put these in a different order. Let me see, so I can put them in the same order. Okay, so here I put them whole brain death first and higher brain death. So let me do that over here. Okay, yeah, so that's how it is. Wait, oh my gosh, okay, I just forgot what I had done. Okay, whole brain death is first, and this one says both the cortex, not context, both the cortex and the brainstem are dead. When both the cortex and the brainstem are dead, you are dead. You are dead. Okay, and higher brain death says when the cortex is dead, not context, cortex is dead, you are dead. Okay, and what's the difference? Well, cortex versus brainstem. So let's talk very briefly about what the cortex does versus what the brainstem does. Okay, so the cortex is when people think about the brain, this is the part of the brain that we think about, that, you know, the wrinkly part, the big stuff, the stuff that's on the outside that everyone imagines when they imagine the brain, okay? And this is also responsible for, if you were to ask someone, what does the brain do? Like anything people would list as an answer is typically something that the cortex does, okay? So the cortex does basically all of your voluntary motions, voluntary movement, okay? Sensation, it's responsible for sensation, for, you know, including things like all modalities of perception, like vision, hearing, etc. Okay? It's responsible for your personality. Okay? There are interesting cases some of you may know of where if you damage the cortex in the right way, someone's personality can change drastically. All right? It's also responsible for your beliefs, your memories, you know, your hopes, your desires, basically everything that makes you kind of the person you are is from the cortex. All right, so what's left for the brainstem? Now the brainstem is, in terms of these two parts of the brain, the cortex versus the brainstem, it is more primitive. Evolutionarily, it is more primitive. We share more in common. Okay, so like lizards have a brain, but our cortex totally blows their cortex away, but our brainstem and a lizard's brainstem are basically the same, okay? So what the brainstem does is it does a lot of the kind of background stuff that we don't think about normally and that just kind of happens in the background. So it can regulate some hormones, okay? And it's responsible for several reflexes that you have. And importantly, one of the most important reflexes, this isn't even a reflex, but one of the most important things it's responsible for is the kind of respiratory drive. So what can happen when you damage the brainstem? If you damage the brainstem enough or in the right place, you lose the instinct to breathe, and what happens is you literally stop breathing and then you die. Okay? And that's, very dangerous. Okay. So regulate hormones responsible for several reflexes. Okay, I think that's enough. All right. So when discussing the difference between higher brain death, where only the cortex dies, versus versus whole brain death, where both the cortex and the brainstem dies, one of the key differences is going to be this respiratory drive. Okay, and that leads us to the Harvard Ad Hoc Committee report, which is the next thing I wanted to talk about. Okay, Harvard Ad Hoc Committee report. Okay, this is 1968, I think. So Singer talks about this. You should read the beginning of his article. It's actually quite a fascinating history, and what he says is spot on. So in 1968, a group of doctors got together, kind of nerdy academic doctors from Harvard, and they formed a committee. It's called an ad hoc committee. Ad hoc is Latin for to the purpose, and the idea is an ad hoc committee just meets with one goal to accomplish, and they are not a regular standing committee that meets over and over again, like once a month or once a year. No, they just meet one time for one purpose, and then they're done. And their purpose was to re-evaluate the definition of death, maybe changing it from CRF to one of the brain death criteria. Okay? Remember, the traditional definition before the Harvard Ad Hoc Committee in 1968 was when you don't have a pulse, when your heart's not beating, when you're not breathing anymore, then you're dead. And this committee wanted to get together and say, well, we have different technology now. We can transplant organs, but also we can keep people, quote unquote, alive on ventilators indefinitely, even though they can no longer breathe on their own. Okay, so they wanted to change the criteria of death, and they did. And here's the criteria they came up with. Okay, so they said, here are the criteria. They said, first, you have to be unresponsive to stimuli. Okay. Second, there has to be no breathing when you're off the ventilator. I think I misspelled that, ventilator. Okay. Third, you have to have no reflexes, including cranial nerve reflexes, many of which originate in the brainstem. Cranial nerve reflexes, if we were in class, I could have like a whole digression about cranial nerve reflexes because they're kind of cool actually. But these are the reflexes like pupillary restriction in response to light. So sometimes, for example, if people have a drug overdose, like heroin overdose, they'll shine a light into their eyeballs. What they're looking for is the pupils to constrict in response to that light. And if that doesn't happen, then they've blown that particular cranial nerve reflex. Turns out there are a lot of cranial nerve reflexes, so they just basically want to test all of them here. Okay. A fourth criteria they have is flat EEG. This is electroencephalogram. Okay, though they say this is technically not necessary. The reason they wanted to say it's technically not necessary is because they didn't want this definition of death to be a problem for like rural areas of the country where people don't have access to EEGs. It would be kind of weird if you don't have access to an EEG, well, nobody ever dies. That would be kind of stupid, right? So they say if you can get an EEG, then confirm it with a flat EEG, but if you can't, that's okay, right? And then the fifth criteria was the usual sort of thing where they wanted to say exclusion of other possibilities that look similar, like hypothermia and certain drug overdoses, okay, that can produce things that are similar to this, all right? So you have to exclude those possibilities. If you can get an EEG, get one, okay? No reflexes, including the cranial nerve reflexes. Shine a light into their eyeball, it doesn't constrict. No breathing when you take them off the ventilator, and, of course, unresponsive to stimuli. All right, so the Harvard Ad Hoc Committee proposed these 5 criteria for the definition of death, And this is basically, I would ask you this in class, what kind of definition is this? Turns out this is a whole brain death definition. Okay? And the reason this is whole brain death, I would ask you that too. Which of these criteria makes this a whole brain death definition? Okay? Okay, it's because of the kind of no breathing, and kind of no cranial nerves. Okay? These are the criteria where, once you see this, you know what they're testing for is brainstem function, not just cortical function, but also brainstem function. Okay? So the Harvard folks, they propose that we treat death as whole brain death. And what that would do, I'm going to maybe go back to an earlier slide here. What that would do is if we treated whole brain death as death, then again, we have all these people in intensive care units who have whole brain death. They have perfect livers, kidneys, hearts, and lungs, and then we can just take their organs. We declare them as dead because really they were all along, according to these doctors. And then we can take their organs and solve this other problem. Okay? That was their proposal, the Harvard Ad Hoc Committee report. All right, so that's the setup for Singer's article. He is going to criticize their proposal. Okay, so Singer. Remember his criticism. Here's a slogan that he states in the article. He says, "Whole brain death is a convenient fiction." Okay, this is kind of the gist or the summary of his criticism of the Harvard Ad Hoc Committee's report. Oh, before I go on and talk about Singer's criticism, this Harvard Ad Hoc Committee report came out in 1968, okay? It proposed these criteria, and these criteria are basically the same criteria that rule the land today in the United States. So, as Singer says, this was kind of an overnight revolution. Just like from one night to the next, literally when this was published, everybody switched over in this country, and most people in the world switched over too. So now if you go, especially in developed, rich countries around this world, everybody uses a whole brain death criteria, a set of criteria for death. That didn't happen, what is this, like 50, 60 years ago. 60 years ago that was not true, but like almost overnight, everybody switched over. And that's the criteria that we use now, okay? Okay, so Singer comes along, a couple of decades later, I think he's writing in the late 80s here, and he says, whole brain death is a convenient fiction. He thinks it's not the right definition of death. Okay? Why is it convenient? I would ask you this if we were in class together. It's convenient because, I already told you the answer, it's convenient because it allows us to get organs we otherwise wouldn't be permitted to harvest, right? Because these people with whole brain death who are not dead by CRF criteria, but are dead by whole brain death criteria, we can just take their organs now, if we use whole brain death as the new definition of death, okay? But it's also a fiction, according to Singer, because Singer says these people aren't really dead. Okay, these people with whole brain death are not really dead. With whole brain death aren't really dead. Why not? Why not? Again, if I were in class, I would ask you this, but I'm not, so I'll just tell you what he says. He says, well, basically, ordinary people don't talk about whole brain death as death. Ordinary people do not recognize whole brain death as death. And that's because many bodily functions continue in whole brain death that would stop in CRF. Okay? And this includes, for example, in whole brain death, you are still warm to the touch. You are still your kind of natural, you have your natural skin tone, okay? Whereas cadavers, when you think of someone who's dead, you think of someone who's cold, you think of someone who's gray, okay? They've lost, the pinkness of the blood that's running, just under their skin, okay? They're warm, they have their natural skin tone. You can hear or feel their heartbeat. So you put your ear on their chest, you can literally hear their heart beating. Whole brain death doesn't kill your heart. Your heart can continue to beat even if you have no brain function. Part of the reason for that is there are, the heart, what generates the heartbeat is electrical impulses. And there are a couple of nodes. There's one in particular that's really important right on the heart itself that just pulses this electrical pulse, and that generates the heartbeat, and you don't need a brain for that. So the heart can continue to beat. Okay? And in fact, these people will continue to digest food and liquid, okay? Which means they need to pee and poop, okay? Now, these people cannot eat with their mouths. They can't swallow, they can't move anything, right? But what you do is you cut a hole into their abdomen, directly into their stomach, and then you can just, put juice in there, or they basically have like a medical smoothie mix that they can just dump right into your stomach. You have to bypass the mouth, because if you put things in the mouths of these people, they could choke, aspirate, it's called, and then get the food into their lungs, get pneumonia, and die. In fact, this is a very common way for people with strokes to die, is from aspiration pneumonia. So what you do is you put a hole directly in the stomach, you put smoothie mix directly in the stomach, and they digest that. Okay, they need to pee and poop. They will continue to grow. Okay, and it's not just like, you've probably heard that cadavers will continue to grow hair and fingernails for a little while. That's true, but these people in whole brain death, they will continue to grow not just hair and fingernails, but they'll grow fat if you overfeed them, right? They'll grow taller if they were kids. Their bones will grow, okay? In fact, here's one of the most, here, another thing that happens is their blood pressure and heart rate rise with pain. So if you do something that's painful to them, you can check the monitor and their heart rate will go up. Their blood pressure will go up with pain. And this, just think about this. This is not the sort of thing that you would think a dead person would do, right? Okay. And then maybe the most dramatic thing that Singer talks about is that you can still gestate a pregnancy. Okay? So sometimes, tragically, someone who gets whole brain death was pregnant at the time that they get whole brain death. They, like one of the cases that Singer talks about later is someone went to a soccer match and there was like a mob or something, and he got trampled and he lost oxygen to his brain. He didn't have enough oxygen to his brain for a few minutes, and so he woke up. He didn't wake up, but he became brain dead. Okay, so that can happen to someone while they're pregnant. And what will happen is the pregnancy will continue to grow and gestate. Now, these women cannot give birth normally with, contractions and deliver through the vagina. But what can happen is you let the pregnancy gestate, and then you do a C-section to get the baby out once it's old enough. All right? And in fact, Singer says, there are headlines, journalist headlines of the following form. And you can see these every few years. If you were to Google, you can find a headline that's just like this, okay? So the journalist headline would go, brain dead woman gives birth, then dies, okay? And so Singer points out, hey, this headline, if brain death is literal death, then this headline is a contradiction, because you can't be brain dead, give birth, and then die, because you are already dead if you're brain dead, according to whole brain death, okay? So that's why Singer says whole brain death is not really death. There are all these things that continue to happen after whole brain death, and then ordinary people, when they see these things, when they see all of this happening, they refuse to believe that the person there is dead, okay? Not always, but sometimes. So sometimes you see legal battles where patients' families refuse to pull plugs, to take out tubes and so on, because they think grandma or whatever is still alive because of these things, the warm natural skin tone, etc., right? Whereas the medical team will say, nope, we have this official criterion, whole brain death. Grandma doesn't meet whole brain death, therefore grandma's dead, therefore we're going to pull plugs, take out tubes and so on, and then if she's an organ donor, if she consented to be an organ donor, we're going to take her organs, okay? And sometimes they get into big fights, okay? And that's the crux of this debate. And Singer says, these ordinary people are right, because look at all these things that these whole brain dead people can do, okay? All right. Okay, let me talk about now 2 objections that Singer discusses to his own view. He says, whole brain death is a convenient fiction, okay? So his own view is Singer's view. We need to go back to the original definition of of death, namely cardiac respiratory function. Because once your heart and lungs stop, once your heart stops, the C, cardiac, once your lungs stop, the R, then you're cold, you're gray, your heart isn't beating anymore. You don't digest food, you don't pee or poop, you don't grow, you don't have blood pressure or heart rate, you can't gestate a pregnancy. Once you have heart and lung death, none of these things happen anymore. Okay? Okay, now a couple of objections that Singer talks about. Okay, 2 objections to Singer's view. So one objection says maybe we can be even more strict in our criteria for whole brain death to eliminate those last brain functions that continue to persist even after the Harvard, criteria for whole brain death. Okay? If so, then we can still rule in many of these people as not quite dead yet. The ones whose heart are still beating, who are still warm, who are still pink and so on, who are still gestating pregnancies and peeing and pooping. We don't have to say that those people are dead yet. Maybe we just need stricter brain death criteria. Okay? So that's one objection. Singer responds to this and he says, if we do this, then what's the point? The whole point, remember, of moving to whole brain death was to get more organs for transplant. But now, if you have an even stricter definition of death, using even fancier whole brain death criteria, where you have to rule out many of these warm people who still have a heartbeat and so on, then you can't get their organs anymore. And that was the whole point of moving to this kind of definition. Okay. The second objection, okay, says that we need to distinguish the person from the organism. Okay? The person is a psychological thing. Okay? It's about, your beliefs, personality, okay, your memories, your hopes, your desires, that sort of thing. Okay? And the organism is this biological thing, right? It's got the liver and the heart and the skin and blood, etc., right? These kinds of things. Okay? So maybe, according to this objection, what we really need is to say, well, okay, for the organism, CRF is the good definition. Okay? When your heart and lungs stop, then the biological organism, the liver, the heart, the skin, the blood, all these things eventually stop working if your heart and lungs stop. Okay? But maybe for the person, okay, something else is best. Maybe some kind of brain death is best. Okay? So that would be, that is a second objection to Singer's view. Now Singer responds to this too. So here's what he says. Okay? So if we go this route, he says, then we should use higher brain death, not whole brain death, for the person. Okay? So for the person, what you really care about is the cortex, not the whole brain. But for the person, remember what goes, if we look back at the, let's see, at this slide, the cortex here is what is responsible for your memories, your hopes, your desires, your beliefs, all that kind of stuff. So as soon as this is blown, then the person is dead. You don't need this brainstem stuff to die too. Okay? Okay. But then Singer says, whole brain death seems even more strange. It seems even more strange to call these people dead with higher brain death. But most people are not willing to call higher brain death people dead. Okay? Because higher brain death people, they're kind of like whole brain death people, except they can even breathe on their own. Okay? Higher brain dead people can breathe on their own. And I'm not sure whether, I think breathe has no E at the end here. I think I spelled it correctly. They can breathe on their own. All right, so you walk up to them in a room, they just look like they're sleeping for all intents and purposes. Remember, this is also sometimes called persistent vegetative state. Persistent vegetative state or higher brain death. Okay? They can breathe on their own. So you put a finger under their nose, you feel the breath going in and out. Okay? So Singer says, think about one of these people with higher brain depth, persistent vegetative state. No one would think, oh, they're dead, let's just put them in a coffin, nail the coffin shut, and put it in the ground. Because these people are warm to the touch, they have the regular skin tone, they are literally breathing. No one would think you can just bury them, just nail them into a coffin and put it right into the ground at that point. Okay? Another thing that this topic that I think are going to end up skipping, but we could have talked about, is dementia. It turns out that in very late stage dementia, these people, the psychological aspect of these people, their belief, personalities, and memories, it's also gone in late stage dementia. But again, people with late stage dementia, we don't think it's okay to just bury them or to take out their organs at that point. Okay, so that's Singer's response to the two objections. Okay, so what's gone wrong? So Singer has a diagnosis and he talks about two cases. Okay, so Singer says, well, what's wrong, the diagnosis, is the definition of death, okay, and the kind of implicit assumption behind it of the sanctity of human life. Okay, so he's kind of confronting a religious doctrine, the sanctity of human life, according to which the sanctity of human life says, human life is always sacred. You may never intentionally end a human life. Okay, so Singer says, okay, here's a doctrine a lot of people believe, the sanctity of human life, but this doctrine is responsible for this kind of incoherent mess that doctors are in now with the definition of death. All right? And he wants to discuss two cases where this kind of sanctity of human life comes under attack. All right. So the two cases, this is the quiz question that I asked you the week before spring break. Okay, so one was Nancy Cruzan, and this is the USA, and the other was Tony Bland, and this is the UK in Great Britain. Okay, both of these people had higher brain death or persistent vegetative state. Okay, so Bland, if I remember correctly, was the one who went to a soccer match and then got trampled in like a riot or something and lost oxygen to his brain for a few minutes. Something similar happened to Nancy Cruzan, although I don't know whether she was trampled at a soccer match or something like that. But however it happened, she also lost kind of oxygen to her brain for a few key minutes. Okay, so both of these people ended up in not whole brain death, but in higher brain death. Okay, so they have persistent vegetative state, they can breathe on their own, their heart and lungs continue to function, they are still warm and pink, and they still pee and poop, and they're both just basically laying in bed and okay. So no one disputed for these two cases, no one said that they are dead, but these two cases went to court because some family members, these were both young people, I think in their 20s or 30s, so they did not have advance directives or living wills. They did not have instructions on how they wanted to be treated, and so we had to guess. And so these two cases went to court where some family members wanted to say, I think we should pull plugs and let Nancy Cruzan die, and other family members said, no, I think we should keep her on the machines and keep her alive. Okay? Same thing with Tony Bland. Some family members wanted to pull all support and let him die. Again, remember, no one disputed, no one thought that they were already dead, but some people wanted to say, pull the plugs, let them die. Other family members said, no, give them full support and keep them alive. Okay, so here's what the court said. The court said, in the US case, that we have to figure out what Nancy Cruzan would have wanted. Okay? Would she have wanted to continue living in this condition of higher brain death? If so, then we should do it. And if not, we shouldn't do it. Okay? And the English court instead, let me put a little space there. The English court instead, for Tony Bland, said they had a different criterion. They said that we have to figure out whether continued life is of any value to Tony Bland. Okay? And they basically, you could put in parentheses something like objective value. Okay, So the US court said we have to figure out what Nancy Cruzan would have wanted. The British court said we have to figure out whether Tony Bland's continued life is of objective value. Answer by the UK court, no value to Tony Bland's living in basically like a vegetable. There's no hope of recovery. He's gonna be a vegetable. His brain is totally gone. His cortex is totally gone. So no value to his continued life. Okay. In contrast, the US court said, well, it just depends on what Nancy Cruzan would have wanted, and there's not enough evidence to say one way or another, so maybe we should keep her alive. Okay? So the answer here was not enough evidence to say that Cruzan would have wanted to die, so err on the side of caution and keep her alive. Okay? Now, Singer, he liked the Bland case. He agrees with the UK courts, okay? Because he thinks it's important to acknowledge that some human life has no value. Okay, and this can be kind of shocking, so I'll say it again. According to Singer, siding with the UK courts, the great British courts, some human life has no value. What kind of human life? Well, life in higher brain death or persistent, aka persistent vegetative state, when your brain is totally gone, okay? So Singer says, these people are alive. Remember, everybody agreed that if you're in higher brain death, persistent vegetative state, you are technically still alive, but this life has no further value to the person who is living. All right, and so Singer says, the importance of these cases is the contrast in what the court said and the fact that the Tony Bland case, according to Singer, this is progress. This is ethical progress to recognize that Tony Bland's life has no further value. It's okay to pull plugs and let him die. Okay? All right. So I guess going back to this slide, you can see how the Tony Bland case, the UK court, the British court, disagreed with this sanctity of human life. The sanctity of human life doctrine says human life is always sacred. You may never intentionally end it. The Tony Bland case says no. Sometimes human life has no value. In those cases, you may intentionally end that human life by pulling plugs, pulling support, all that kind of stuff. All right? Okay, so now Singer says, well, we really, when we're thinking about brain death, we have to diagnose, or we have to think about 3 separate questions, and there are multiple ways you can answer those questions. So that's what I want to do here, and I hope this chart, I hope I have enough room. Okay, so Singer says we have to separate out 3 different questions. When do we die? When may we end a life intentionally? And then when may we take organs from somebody? Okay, and there's 3 ways of answering that. Before 1968, before Harvard, the old-fashioned answers. The Harvard answer, which is the standard answer that we go by today in the medical profession. And then what Singer thinks that those answers should be. Okay? So when do we die? Well, according to before 1968, this was CRF. When your heart and lungs fail, that's when you die. That was the traditional answers. When your heart and lung fails, you die. When may we end life? Never. This is the sanctity of human life. Sanctity of human life. Remember? So we may never end a human life. When may we take organs? At death. Okay? So notice how, of these 3 questions, when do we die, when may we end life, and when may we take organs, the first question is a scientific question. The second and third questions are ethical questions. When may we do one thing or another? When may we do this other thing? Okay? The first question is not a when may we, it's when do we. It's a scientific question. All right. So, Harvard, when do we die according to Harvard? Well, remember, they said we die at whole brain death, when your entire brain is dead. Now, according to Harvard, when may we end a life? They just carry on the same answer as the traditional answer. So the traditional answer was never. They say, again, never. Okay? Same answer as before. When may we take organs? Same answer as before, at death. So Harvard, they don't want to give a new answer to the ethical question, okay, the 2 ethical questions of when may we end life or when may we take organs. They want to give in a way, the same answers to ethical questions. We may never end a human life because of the sanctity of human life. We may take organs only at death. But they want to give a different answer to the scientific question. Okay? Singer says that's wrong. They're just using words incorrectly to cover an ethical change, a shift in an ethical paradigm. So Singer says what we instead should do is be just linguistically, semantically honest about what we're doing. We should be honest and say that when do people die? It's really CRF still. Okay, so Singer supports the original definition of death, CRF. Okay, when may we end a human life? Singer says. Well, Harvard, they wanted to finesse it by saying, well, these people technically are already dead, so we can say, formally that we're never ending life. But let's be honest, Singer says. Let's be honest, we may end a life when the life has no further value. When the life has no further value, like whole brain death, also higher brain death. When the life has no further value, we may end it, Singer says. Okay? And then when may we take organs? Singer says, again, no further value to life. Okay? So Singer says, when may we end a life? No further value. And then he imports the same answer down to this third cell, this bottom right cell. No further value is also when we may take organs. Okay. So Singer says, the mess we got into was Harvard. They give this incorrect, ridiculous, according to Singer, definition of death, just so that they would never have to change the face value of their answers to these ethical questions. But Singer says, let's be honest about what we're doing, okay? Use the original correct definition of death, cardiac respiratory function, but then say, when may we end a life? When it has no further value. Let's just be honest, okay? Reject the sanctity of life. When may we take organs? Again, no further value to life. So here's what Singer would say. These people in the ICUs with whole brain death, he would say they are still alive, and yet we may transplant their organs. So let me add this on another slide. Summary of Singer's position, okay? All those people in ICUs with whole brain death, not everyone in an ICU has whole brain death, but some people might in an ICU have whole brain death, okay? Singer will say they are still alive, but it's okay to kill them to take their organs. Okay? In contrast, the Harvard ad hoc committee will say they are already dead, so we may take their organs. Okay? So in a way, functionally, the two agree. They both say you may you may unplug all the machines, wheel them to the OR, cut them up, etc., take their organs. They both say that, okay? You may unplug all the machines, wheel them into the OR, cut them up, take their organs. Not organs, okay? It's just that the Harvard ad hoc committee will say they were already dead to begin with. We'll say they were already dead before we started. And Singer will say they were still alive when we started. But it's still okay. But it's still ethically fine. Okay, so that's Singer's position. He thinks the definition of death, this controversy about what it should be, we should go back to the old original criterion of death, CRF. Okay, we should be honest and label those people as still alive and be honest about what we're doing when we unplug all the machines, wheel them into the OR, cut them up, take their organs. We are killing these people, okay, Singer says, and yet that's totally fine. Okay, and that, I think, is a pretty good summary of the Singer article. And I will be back later and talk about Elisa Koppelman's article. All right, thanks.